Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Advances in Parathyroid Hormone Testing. I'm Christina Jewell of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots and sponsored by DiaSorin Incorporated. DiaSorin offers the best fully automated infectious disease and specialty diagnostics menu, including best-in-class vitamin D. These quality assays are analyzed on the versatile Liaison XL platform. They provide value through sales, service, and support solutions to hospital and reference laboratories by consolidating their menu in order to streamline processes and increase efficiency. For more information, please go to www.diasorin.com. Before we begin, just a couple of important announcements. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window or submit your problem through the green Q&A button on the lower left. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. Our speaker today is Etienne Cavalier. Etienne Cavalier was born in Liège, Belgium in 1971. He received his master's in pharmaceutical sciences in 1994, his advanced master in clinical biology in 1999, and his PhD in pharmaceutical and biomedical sciences in 2010 from the University of Liège. Etienne Cavalier is now professor of clinical chemistry at the University of Liège and head of the Department of Clinical Chemistry at the CHU de Liège. His main research topics are linked with phosphocalcic metabolism, renal function, frailty, and sarcopenia. Etienne Cavalier has published over 200 papers, 6 book chapters, and has an H-index of 25. Dr. Cavalier also serves on the Clinica Chimica Acta's editorial board. I will now turn this over to Dr. Cavalier for his presentation. Dr. Cavalier?
Thank you very much, Christy, for this very kind introduction. So, as you mentioned, the topic of today would be the advance in parathyroid hormone testing, and welcome everybody to this session, which I hope will be very interesting for you. So first, any off-label information made in this presentation is for educational uses only. So as you probably all know, PTH1-84 is a 1-84 peptide, which clinical activity is linked to the first 7 amino acids in the amino-terminal form, which is highlighted here in red. So parathyroid hormone circulates in the blood with a lot of C-terminal fragments that you can see on the bottom right. And these fragments are truncated in the very large portion of the peptide. But next to these C-terminal fragments, there is also what we call the PTH784, and you can see that this PTH lacks the red amino acids, so the N-terminal amino acids, which mean that these fragments do not have the biological activity. But these fragments accumulate in the serum of patients suffering from chronic kidney disease, and these fragments possess a higher half-life than the PTH1-84 itself. And you can see also on the bottom left of the screen the amino PTH, which is a 1-84 complete PTH, but you can see that it's phosphorylated on the serine in position 17. So now we've got the peptides, but we've got also the assays. And what do they recognize? First, the first generation PTH assays. These assays were classical radioimmunoassays in which there was a single antibody directed against the C-terminal part of the peptide. As you can see on the cartoon, these immunoassays recognize the PTH 1 to 84, but also the C-terminal fragments and the PTH 7 to 84. Of course, this assay definitely lacked any specificity, and they were quite quickly abandoned. The reason why I mentioned these assays that were provided in the 50s is that they have been designed by two Nobel Prize, Rosalind Yellow and Saul Berson, who were the very first ones to develop these kinds of assays. And the first one actually was insulin. So these kits were very quickly abandoned to give the place of what we call now second generation PTH assays or intact PTH assays. These assays use two antibodies and not one antibody. Two antibodies, one directed, as you can see, on the C-terminal part of the peptide, and a second antibody, which is directed against a more amino-terminal part of the peptide. These assays were called intact because when they were designed, people saw that the people saw that if there was a sandwich assay, they only capture the intact PTH. But the problem is that very soon the researchers observed that there was an over-recovery of PTH in patients suffering from chronic kidney disease, and you can see why. Of course, this on the bottom right of the cartoon, these assays did not recognize anymore the C-terminal fragments, and this is a good thing. But these assays recognize the 7 to 84 PTH. And these assays do not recognize the amino PTH because the phosphorylation of the serine on position 17. So it's not true that these are intact PTH, which is recognized by these second generation assays, but they recognize the 1 to 84 PTH, but also the 7 to 84 PTH, or what we call the big amino-truncated fragments. Now came, in the early 20s, the third generation PTH assays. The difference is that the antibody directed against the amino-terminal part of the peptide is directed against the first amino acids of the peptide. So which means that these assays recognize, of course, the PTH 1 to 84, but they do not recognize anymore the PTH 7 to 84. It's also interesting to notice that this assay recognize the amino PTH because there is not this problem with the serine in position 17, and we will go on later on like this. So, as you can hear what I've been saying up to now, there are two generations of PTH assays that are currently being used in laboratories. The second, or intact PTH assays, or the third generation PTH assays. The question is, which one should we use? Is there a benefit of using one or the other? So let's look at the clinical practice. And here in this paper, my friend Daniel Cruzon, showing in 2013, was studying patients suffering from severe heart failure. And he divided his patients in 3 tertiles, and he's been looking at the mortality of those patients. On the top, you can see that the patient which had the higher tertile of PTH had the higher chance to die. But he tested 2 different generations of PTH, the third generation PTH in B and the intact or second generation in A, and you can see that obviously there is no difference in the prediction in the ROC curve whether you are using a second or a third generation. But these 2 assays gives exactly the same clinical information. And this is also very important when you look at this paper, which is the workshop, international workshop on hyperparathyroidism, which defined the guidelines for patients suffering from hyperparathyroidism. And this is the very last one, the first edition. And you can see that they raised these very important questions: do third generation PTH assay perform better clinically than second generation PTH assays for the diagnosis of primary hyperparathyroidism? And their conclusion was, we conclude as that you can either use second or third generation PTH assays for the diagnosis of primary hyperparathyroidism. So it's also important to notice that you can use both second and third generation for the diagnosis and the follow-up of patients suffering from primary hyperparathyroidism. Sorry for that. Okay. Another really important question is, what about the intra-individual variation of the third generation and the second generation PTH assay? The intra-individual variation is something very important in clinical chemistry field because it allows you to calculate the least significant change, and it also helps you to define goals for analytical validation. And there have been different studies, and I'm showing you two studies that have been studying the intra-individual variation of second and third generation of PTH, measured by second and third generation PTH assays. The first here on the top, on the left, is the Gardham team, which published in CGSN in 2010 the intra-individual, which is the second column CVI. In healthy volunteers and in hemodialyzed patients. And you can see that intact PTH has an intra-individual CV of 19% in healthy volunteers, and the bio-intact or third generation PTH assay had a CVI which was a little slightly higher than the intact PTH. It was the same in hemodialyzed patients, where the intra-individual CV for PTH was slightly higher, 25.6% for intact, and it was even higher for bio-intact PTH at 30%. So it may seem surprising that the third generation PTH as determined by third generation has a slightly higher CV than the intact PTH. Our team also tried to define the intra-individual CV of PTH by second and third generation assays. And we found results that were a little bit lower than what Gardham found, because we found an intra-individual CV of 13.8% for the intact PTH. It was slightly the same, 14.9% for third generation PTH assay. So roughly, this data show that the intra-individual CV of PTH as measured by second or third generation PTH assay is slightly the same. What about now the correlation with different biochemical markers? And I've presented you two different biochemical markers. The first on the top, published by O'Flaherty in Clinical Biochemistry in 2013. And he correlated on A, intact PTH, or on B, bio-intact PTH, so third generation, with different markers, EGFR, age, gender, albumin, phosphate, bone alkaline phosphatase, and 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And he showed that there was a very good negative correlation between EGFR and PTH, a very good positive correlation, well, at least correlation between PTH and bone alkaline phosphatase, and there was also a correlation, significant correlation between between 25-hydroxy and PTH. And he did the same for the third generation PTH, and you can see that he observed exactly the same coefficient of correlation with the same more or less p-value. So showing that PTH as measured by second and third generation PTH has the same correlation with these biomarkers. Going back to the paper of my friend Damien, he correlated the PTH with different markers that are used in the cardiovascular field, which are anti-proBNP, galectin, troponin, and things like this. And you can see on the right of the table that the bioactive third generation or intact PTH second generation have exactly the same correlation and exactly the same p-value. So we can say that they correlate in the same way with those different biomarkers. Another very important point in the follow-up of hemodialyzed patients is to make the distinction between the patients that have a high turnover, bone turnover, versus those which have a non-high turnover, and on the opposite, those which have a low bone turnover from those who don't have a non-low bone turnover. And nephrologists are using different biomarkers to try to assess this turnover. And there is a very, very interesting paper from Stuart Sprague last year, in which he managed to put some cutoff values with different biomarkers, and he calculated whether these cutoff were aimed to distinguish between those patients suffering from high or non-high or low versus non-low bone markers. And he tested both generation of PTH, as you can see the first line, intact PTH, and WPTH, which stands for third generation PTH. And you can see that the area under the curve for intact or whole PTH in low versus non-low or high versus non-high is very, very similar. So again, intact or third generation PTH assay are providing the same clinical information. So now we can ask, I've shown you that second or third generation PTH could be used, but then what would be the drivers to use third generation PTH assays? And for me, my answer is traceability and standardization. This is a very important paper published by my friend Jean-Claude Souberbian 10 years ago. In this study, he sent 3 different pools that had a value of 150, 300, and 1000 nanogram per liter of PTH, with the Allegro intact PTH, which was at that time more or less the reference PTH assay. And he sent those pools to different labs in France, just asking them to measure PTH. And look at the result he obtained. For the second in line, the intact PTH IRMA, the values were 83, 160, and 517, which means that it was half of the value that had been obtained with the Allegro intact PTH. Going down, you can see that with the DSL PTH immunoradiometric assay, for the value at 150, the lab had obtained 323, 638, and more than 2000, meaning that there was a factor of 2. They were 2 times higher than the value that had been obtained with the Allegro, which also means that there was a magnitude of 4 between the intact PTH immunoradiometric assay and the DSL PTH. So how can you imagine that PTH can give a magnitude of 4 between different assays? That's really a problem. You may say, okay, that was in 2006, so what's going on by now? And these are the data from the Belgium Institute of Public Health. So the Belgium Institute of Public Health in 2013, doing that every year, 4 times a year, sending pools to different labs, to all the labs in Belgium. And they test also the PTH. And look at the results that you have in Belgium with the PTH. We got also a value, for instance, the median F50 for the diasterine third generation PTH assay, but you can be up to 109 with the Abbott Architect intact PTH. So again, a factor of 2 nowadays in different labs using different methods on PTH. So there is definitely a need of standardization of those PTH assays, because for the moment, different labs are reporting values that are totally different from each other. The question is, could we standardize the PTH method? Well, what are the requirements? First, you need to have an international ring-nest to standardize the assays, and this should be performed under the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry auspices. Second, you also need to have commutable international standards which should be available to calibrate the assays, to provide them to manufacturers so that manufacturers can calibrate their assays. And third, you need also to have an universally accepted reference method, which should be a tandem mass spec method as a reference method. So what do we need? What do we have now? There is definitely a working group on PTH standardization working under the auspices of the IFCC, and you can see that there are lots of specialists in this IFCC group. This group is held by Cathy Sturgeon in Scotland, and there is this willingness to standardize from this working group. That's really a good point. As an international standard, so there is also an international standard of PTH, which is owned by the WHO. It's the 95646 international standard, and it's pure human recombinant. Whether it is commutable or not is still a bit of a debate, but there is definitely a recombinant PTH 184 WHO standard for PTH standardization. Do we have reference method? Well, there are a few time-aspect methods that have been published on PTH determination in 2010 with a limit of quantification that were about 39 for the first one and of 16 with the second one. So there are already time-aspect methods that are using a triptych digestion of the peptide before, of course, determination. And this is in the paper from Kumar published in 2010 in ClinChem. You can see on the y-axis the time-aspect and on the x-axis the Roche PTH assays. And you can see that there is a good correlation, not perfect of course, but there is a good correlation between the time-aspect method and the immunoassay. That is really a good point also. The problem is that if you go to the supplemental data of the method, you can see the CV, which are something like between 10 to 20% in intra-assay, 20% in inter-assay precision. So this definitely needs to be improved. So what conclusion can we have on PTH standardization? Well, it's possible. We can standardize PTH, but I'm seeing that the IVD companies are not really want to move forward because they don't know whether it's interesting or not, so that's a problem. There are also time-aspect methods, but they are not satisfactory yet. For instance, just like we can have with the vitamin D. With vitamin D, there are excellent reference methods, but for PTH, that's not that's still a problem. And the big problem for me with PTH standardization is that the different kits of intact PTH that are on the markets have a different cross-reactivities with the PTH fragments, which means that in healthy patients where you don't have huge amounts or high amounts of PTH fragments, you can achieve a standardization without any problem. But we are not very much focusing on healthy patients. We are focusing on diseased patients and also on hemodialyzed and CKD patients. And in those patients, the GFR declines. And if the GFR declines, there will be accumulation of fragments. And the antibodies that are used in the second generation or intact PTH assays will cross-react differently with these antibodies, which means that you will lose the standardization. For me, the only possibility to have a full standardization of PTH is to use third generation PTH assays, because in those assays, even in patients suffering from kidney disease, you will not have any cross-reaction with those fragments, meaning that you will have a standardization in healthy individuals, but also in patients suffering from chronic kidney disease. And this cartoon comes from the UK NIQUAS, the British Control on PTH, and this data show that what they've done, is that they have spiked 1 to 84 PTH. I know that it's not the best way, but they spiked 1 to 84 PTH, and they've been looking at the cross-reactivity and the recovery of the different assays that are available on the market. And you can see that the recovery of on the international standards on the right column can be quite different according to the assay that is used. For instance, the diacerin 1 to 84 PTH, which only recognize 1 to 84 PTH, will have a 102% of cross-reactivity, whereas the Abbott architect can have a cross-reactivity of 200, and the others can have various activities. The Roche will have a cross-reactivity of 150%. Of course, this is spiking studies. This is not probably what happens in real life, but this is quite interesting. What is more interesting for me is the cross-reactivity with 7 to 84 PTH, which show that the only third generation PTH assay that was in this study, which is the diacerin liaison assay, has no cross-reactivity with the 7 to 84 PTH. And you can see that the other immunoassays, the second generation immunoassay, whether they come from Beckman, they come from Siemens or whatsoever, they have a quite important cross-reactivity, quite important recovery that can go from 50 to 150% of cross-reactivity, which definitely show that, of course, if it's again spiking studies, I would agree on that, but this definitely show that the cross-reactivity of this intact PTH assay is with the 7284 or as a PTH will be different. So the standardization, even if this method was fully standardized, they will come with different results, and the standardization is lost. And this is finally the very important slide that I also wanted to share with you, is that I have the opportunity to have 3 third-generation PTH assays in my lab. The first, the diacerin one, the Roche one, because Roche is also a third-generation PTH assay available at least in Belgium, and the final one is from Fuji Radio, the Limipert third-generation PTH assay. And these are 100 hemodialyzed patients that are run with these 3 methods. And you can see the slope with the, for instance, diacerin liaison and Lumipers on the left. The slope is of 1.03 in 100 hemodialyzed patients. You will never have that with any other immuno-intact PTH assays. With the Roche, between the liaison and the Roche, the slope is very good, also at 0.94, intercept a little bit higher, and the Lumipers versus the Roche has a slope of 0.92. But honestly, this is, for me, the very first time that I have the opportunity to present 3 different third-generation PTH assay in 100 hemodialyzed patients, showing so nice correlate slopes between all of them. What is also important when you standardize, and what we have tried to do here in this paper published in ClinChem in 2014, is the impact that this standardization can have on the reference range. Before the restandardization, so what we did basically is that we restandardized ourselves. So we took serum from patients that had undetectable PTH levels, and we spiked with the international standard, and we build a curve, and we started work on this international standard. And then we run hemodialyzed patients. We also run healthy subjects. When you look at the IFU not the IFU, I'm sorry. When you look at the reference range of the liaison and the Roche third generation PTH assay, as determined in our laboratory, before our own restandardization, you can see that the upper right, the higher limit, was 33 picograms from the liaison, and it was quite much higher with the Roche. It was 49 picograms per ml with the third generation from Roche. Not the intact, the third generation, but the intact will have the same. When after restandardization with the international standard, you can see that the upper reference range from liaison diacerin third generation is 46. Whereas for the Roche it was of 45. So this was done on 120 healthy males and 120 healthy females. What this cartoon shows is that if you restandardize your PTH assays, you will have the same reference range of your PTH assay with the third generation, which is totally impossible for the moment with the intact PTH or second generation PTH assays. And this make me come to a very important question, which is how should we establish the reference range for PTH in the laboratory? Because there are 2 different voices. The first one comes from the ISO 15189 guidelines or whatever other clinical chemistry guidelines, telling that laboratories should verify the manufacturer's reference range. And how are we supposed to verify? We are supposed to take 20 healthy subjects and to run them with the assay and check if there is one out of those 20 which is out of the reference range provided by the manufacturer. But if you look into the instruction for use of your kits, you will read that manufacturers tell you that you should establish your own reference range, meaning that you have to select yourself 120 healthy males, 120 healthy females, and start to run the parameter and establish yourself the reference range. So it's totally different. On one hand, we just have to check the reference range on 20 healthy subjects. On the other hand, you have to establish your own reference range on 120 healthy males or females. The question is, okay, we have to establish the reference range, but how should we establish the reference range for PTH? But the answer is that you should avoid any conditions of primary or secondary hyperparathyroidism. So you should not include into your healthy subject population anybody which is suffering from secondary hyperparathyroidism. And for such purpose, you definitely need to check the renal function. So you should measure creatinine and check for the eGFR. And you should also test 25-hydroxyvitamin D, because of course you all know that if you've got a decrease in your 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels, you will start to have an increase into your PTH level. So you'll be suffering from secondary hyperparathyroidism. So you should only include into your reference population subjects which have normal values of 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which I have set here at 30 nanogram per ml. Of course, the subject should have normal calcium and phosphorus levels and should have normal calcium incomes, even if it's more complicated to check. Do you think that manufacturers, most of them at least, have included in those patients, in those subjects that have been used for establishing the reference range, do you think that they have checked the creatine, they have checked the vitamin D, the calcium and phosphorus? No, they have not. Most of them have just included normal healthy population without checking for this kind of parameters. And another important point is that most of those reference range that you can see on the IFU of your kids have only been established in white Caucasian population and not for any other population. So in this paper that we published in 2012, we have compared the reference range from the manufacturers provided in the insert for use of the kids, and we have established the reference range for all these assays on 120 healthy men, 120 healthy women, which all had normal renal function, normal 25-hydroxyvitamin D, normal calcium, normal phosphorus. And what you can see is that the difference can be very high. For those highlighted in red, for instance, the manufacturers provided an upper reference range of 88, whereas we found it to be 47. You can see that with the diazoxide intact in your radiometric assay, which I don't think is still available in the market, it was 54, whereas we found it to be at 36. And you can also see that with the Roche indexes, guess that most Roche users, and not only Roche users, know that the upper reference range of the intact PTH from Roche is 65 picogram per ml. And we found it to be at 50 picogram per ml. And it's not, we are not the only one to find that. My friend Jean-Claude Subabel in another paper also found that the upper reference range of the Roche second generation assay was 50 and not 65. Question is, how do you know how Roche established their reference range? But they did not. Actually, what they did, they calibrated their kit, or they had more or less the same antibody with the Allegro kit, and they took the reference range provided at the time by Allegro, by Nichols. And how did Nichols establish their reference range? Well, actually, they took something like 80 subjects from the area of Boston, and these subjects were probably deficient in 25-hydroxyvitamin D because they were suffering from secondary hyperparathyroidism. But still, 65 is still the cutoff of the upper reference range which is provided by Roche, whereas it is not 65, it is 50. And it's the same for many others of these manufacturers. Now, do you think that it makes a difference of using an upper reference range of 50 or, for instance, 65 for Roche? Or is it just, I'm just, killing odds? Okay, what is there is it important? To show that, I've calculated how many patients were compressed between 50 and 65 picogram per ml in my own daily routine. And I can show you that 80% of my PTH values, so 80% of my patients present a PTH which is ranging between 50 and 65 picogram per ml, which means 1 out of 5 of my patients. And when I look at the data of these patients, most of them are vitamin D deficient. They present a 25-hour-C vitamin D value below 13 mg per ml, which show that if this goes on between 50 and 65, they start to suffer from secondary hyperparathyroidism. And it will be only when the PTH will be at 65 or above that perhaps a medical decision will be taken. But still, they suffer from secondary hyperparathyroidism due to a low 25-hour CD. And if you use the cutoff of 65, you will miss it, and that's it. Another impact of having good reference range, good established reference range, is to classify hemodialyzed patients according to KDIGO guidelines. KDIGO guidelines are international guidelines which are used to take care of hemodialyzed patients. And in those guidelines, it is stated that a hemodialyzed patient should have a PTH value which is compressed between 2 and 9 times the upper reference range of the lab. So if you are using your own, again, if I come to Roche, if I'm using the Roche assay, the KDIGO guidelines tell me that my patient should have a PTH value between 100 and 450. If I'm using 65 as the IFU, as stated in the IFU, it will be more from 130 to 500 and so. So it can make a difference in the follow-up of those patients, and we have also published that. Here on the left side, you see the classification of more than 100 hemodialyzed patients according to the guidelines. In the white squares, it's the areas where the two different PTH assays. On the y-axis is the Abbott Architect assay. On the x-axis is the Diacerin third generation PTH assay. And you can see that if you are using the reference range provided by Abbott and Diacerin, you will have on the upper side of the slide, you will have in the gray zone quite an important, it's from 8 to 10% of patients which will not be classified in the same way when you are using the reference range provided by the manufacturers. Now, on the right, if you are using the reference range that we have published and which are been established by the laboratories, you can see that there is no more any misclassification of those patients according to the KDIGO guideline. So again, having good reference range, good established reference range allows you to better classify the patients and also have the same clinical decision in those patients. So this is definitely very important to have good guideline for PTH assays. Another point very important with PTH is the stability of the peptide. The PTH is known to be not so a peptide which is quite not stable because there are many studies on PTH stabilities. But when you look at and when you start to review all those studies, you start to see that these studies are somehow quite contradictory. Indeed, there are different, the results of the study may be different if the study stability is performed in hemodialyzed or healthy subjects. There are some studies have been performed in plasma or serum, but not necessarily on whole blood or clotted blood just before centrifugation. Another important point, which is sometimes missing or sometimes misleading, is the definition of the T0. So the T0 is when it might be samples that has been already been frozen for 2, 3, or 6 months, and you compare the degradation of the PTH to this point, which doesn't make any sense. And there are lots of paper which sometimes on very low number of patients. So it's very complicated. And what is also very complicated is that there is no clear definition of unstability. So there are different authors say that PTH is stable or not stable according to cutoff, which are just 10, 20, 25, whatsoever percentage of degradation, but which it can be different according to the authors. So for us, and we published that very recently, paper just for a few days available online. For us, there are three definitions of instability. The first one is purely statistical. So you make a study and you observe the degradation after a few times, and you perform, for instance, a Wilcoxon test, and the Wilcoxon test will tell you whether the peptide is stable or not, if there is a significant difference between before and after. But this is purely statistical, and it does not probably reflect the importance of what is PTH and what is there is no fine-tuning on the evaluation of the instability. A second way to define instability is to use, just like the ISO guidelines 5725 tells you, what is called the acceptable change limit. This is this acceptable change limit, as you can see, is root square of 2, because there are 2 measurements, multiplied by 1.96, which means that is the 95% change of degradation, multiplied by the intra-individual intra-assay analytical CV. So you have to run the samples in duplicate and have to use the CV of these duplicates. This is very interesting. This can depend, of course, the stability depends on the performance of your test. But this is purely analytical. And for me, this is not very satisfactory, but because what is more important is whether this degradation that we see, is it clinically significant or not? And this is the reason why I prefer to use this, what is called the total change limit, which take into consideration the analytical and the biological variation. So here you can have here the formula, which is the square root of 1.96 multiplied by 2 multiplied by the analytical CV, the square exposed to square, plus half of the intra-individual coefficient of variation that you can find in, for instance, in Westgard's table. So 3 different definitions of instability: one purely statistical, one purely analytical, and one taking into consideration analytical and biological variation. So what we've done in this paper is that we selected 10 healthy volunteers and 10 hemodialyzed patients. We wanted to study the stability of the peptide when it's not treated by the lab. I mean, in whole clot blood or in EDTA blood. So we took 5 pairs of tubes, of EDTA and gel tubes, and the first pair were centrifuged directly and immediately run, and that was our T0. The second pair was kept at 4 hours at 4 hours at 4 degrees, and after that was centrifuged, and the supernatant was kept at -80. The third pair was kept during 18 hours at 4 degrees and then centrifuged. The fourth pair was kept at room temperatures during 4 hours and then centrifuged. And the fifth pair was kept at 25 degrees during 18 hours and then centrifuged. 1 week after, we run all those samples in the same batch in duplicate to avoid any analytical issues. On the table on the bottom, you can see the results in the healthy subjects and on the left in the hemodialyzed patients. And what is interesting to see is that we tested, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that we test the stability with third generation liaison XL assay and with the third generation Cobas assay, and with the second generation from Diacerin and second generation of Floge. You can see that even in the healthy subjects, there are not so many discrepancies between the assay, but again, when you look on the right, you will see that the third generation assays are much closer of agreement compared to the intact PTH assays. Here are the results. The acceptable change limits according to the method in healthy subjects and hemodialyzed subjects. You can see that the ACL is something like 4 to 5%, whereas the total change limit that takes into consideration the intra-individual variation and the analytical variation will be more about 12 to 13% in healthy subjects according to the assay that is used. In hemodialyzed patients, the acceptable change limits will be ranging from 4 to 8%, whereas the total change limit will be a little bit around 15 to 17%. And of course, you will have different decision of stability if you are using the Wilcoxon test. If you are using the Wilcoxon test, you will see the results tell you that PTH is not stable. If you are using the acceptable change limit, you will see that the PTH will be more or less stable for 4 hours in EDTA and serum. But if you are using the total change limit, you can see that PTH is a quite stable peptide, and only when you leave the serum untreated at 25 degrees during 8 hours, you will have a significant degradation. So PTH is as stable, taking into consideration the total change limit in EDTA or in serum, except if the samples stay for 18 hours and at 25 degrees. So the conclusion of the paper are that PTH is as stable in EDTA than as stable in serum, except if you are working with centers or GPs that provide you samples that have not been treated for less than 18 hours at room temperature. Otherwise, I do recommend serum because you can measure calcium. So PTH, stability of PTH is something that is very important. This was the short-term stability, but two years ago we published the long-term stability that was done with third-generation PTH assay from the Serum, and we tested the long-term stability at -80, at -80 and -20 degrees. And you can see that either serum or EDTA plasma, PTH is as stable in serum or in EDTA plasma up to 1 year when the samples are kept at -80 or at -20 degrees, which is also very important. So long-term stability of PTH, EDTA or serum is the same, and PTH is very stable when it's kept for a long time. Now, I would like to come to something that is very important, which is the parathyroid carcinoma. I agree that it's a very rare disease. It's one out of 1,000 parathyroid adenoma. But the problem is that this patient died very soon after the diagnosis. Well, soon. There are lots of people dying from the carcinoma because in this patient have huge amount of blood calcium, and these patients suffer from renal kidney disease, and they die because of this very severe hypercalcemia. And the problem is that the diagnosis of parathyroid carcinoma is very difficult, and there are no good tools for the diagnosis of parathyroid carcinoma. And what I would like to present here today is the use of a tumor marker, which I call the ratio third and second generation PTH, for the diagnosis and the follow-up of patients suffering from parathyroid carcinoma. The amino-PTH, as I presented you earlier, is a PTH that is phosphorylated probably on the serine in position 17, which has been discovered by Pierre Damour in 2003. This amino-PTH is recognized by third-generation PTH assay, but it's not recognized by second-generation PTH assays, except a little bit from the one from Roche. So we know that this amino-PTH contains the first 4 amino acids, that it's different from the native 184 in the 1520 part of the peptide, and it's about not more than 10% of the 1 to 84 PTH in normal individual, which means that if you run a third and a second generation PTH assay in the same individual, the ratio with the value that you obtain should always be lower than 1 in normal healthy individual. Because when you measure the ratio, what are you measuring? Measuring third generation, you measure 1 to 84 PTH plus the amino-PTH. When you measure the second generation, you measure the 1 to 84 PTH plus the 7 to 84 PTH. And since amino-PTH is much lower concentration compared to the 7 to 84 PTH, the ratio should always be lower than 1, of course, if the kits are standardized, again, the same standard. We know that this amino-PTH is overproduced in patients suffering from parathyroid cancer and also in some kind of severe primary hyperparathyroidism. And in those patients suffering from parathyroid cancer, because of this increase of amino-PTH, the ratio becomes higher than 1, which cannot happen in other kind of patients. And we published on that a paper in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, where we tested this ratio in one of the largest cohorts of patients suffering from parathyroid cancer, which is on the far right of the cartoon. And you can see that we had 24 patients suffering from parathyroid cancer. And you can see that the ratio out of those 24 patients, 4 patients only presented a normal ratio, whereas the 20 others had an inverted ratio. We compared this population of patients suffering from parathyroid cancer to healthy elderly individual, renal transplant patient, hemodialyzed patient, parathyroid adenoma patient, and you can see that all these comparative populations presented a ratio below 1. So definitely we could make the distinction between those patients suffering from parathyroid carcinoma, which is again a disease which is not frequent but is very aggressive and for which there is no good diagnostic tools. We could make a difference between these patients and other kind of patients. This led Schultz publishing in Nature Review Endocrinology. He reviewed all the characteristics of the ratio as a tumor markers, and as a tumor marker, the positive predictive value was 96%, negative predictive value 89%, sensitivity of 76% and specificity of 98.5%, which is, if you compare to the usual tumor markers, which is excellent. So what could be the use of the ratio in postoperative follow-up monitoring of patients with parathyroid cancer? And this is a very interesting paper published by Caron in 2017. So this is the story of a lady who was suffering from parathyroid carcinoma. And you can see that above the first arrow, she was at her she had fourth parathyroid surgery. And when she at that time she had her fourth surgery, her calcium level was extremely high at 3.8 millimoles, and the ratio you can see on the right far right column, the ratio was very high also at 2.95. So she underwent her fourth surgery, and the first the first result you obtained was a normalization of her calcium level at 1.85, and also you can see on the right a normalization of the ratio, which was at 0.70. So patient might be cured. But look at the follow-up of the patient. Second blood drawing, 6 months later, 2.18 the calcium. Okay. Then 6 months later, 2.25. Then 2.35. Then 2.60, and then 2.82, 3.22. The upper limit was, and then after 3.22, she had a fifth surgery for parathyroid carcinoma. What is important to look is that at the time she had the calcium at the higher, we were higher than upper reference range at 2.60. The ratio was already at 3.53. And look, 6 months earlier, her calcium was still at 2.33, but her ratio was already inverted, and which proves that this patient should have underwent a surgery quite earlier than this. So the ratio is much more predictive than calcium level for the parathyroid cancer, the recurrence of parathyroid cancer. Sorry. So in this review published by Schultz, he proposed some kind of rule of thumb. When a patient suffers from primary hyperparathyroidism, and what he called the less than 3 rule means that if the lesion is less than 3 centimeter, or if the calcium values are lower than 3 millimoles, then this lesion is not considered as non-suspicious and needs a local excision. But if one of those rules, so if the lesion is higher than 3, or if the calcium is higher than 3, then the lesion becomes suspicious, and he proposed to have a PTH assay ratio to run the ratio, so second and third generation PTH assay, and if the ratio becomes higher than 1, then the patient is suspected from suffering from parathyroid cancer and should undergo an oncological surgery. Same if once there is a suspicious lesion, of course there is an en bloc resection, and you look at the surgical margins. If the patient, if they are positive, and if the patient still presents a ratio higher than 1, the surgery should be repeated, and perhaps that the patient should undergo therapy. So this means that this ratio now should be used in routine for those patients. When we had those very nice data, we used the Scantibodies duo immunoradiometric assay. But unfortunately, it has become very complicated to get this assay available in Belgium. On the other hand, we don't have so much the opportunity to run radioimmunoassay because it needs specialized rooms and specialized technicians. And of course, it's quite expensive because you need to have 2 curves, you need to have, and we are not using those assays in routine, and we have automated method. And it's important for the surgeon to have a fast result on that, which cannot be possible with the radioimmunoassay because we cannot have always one in our stock. So we have tried to say, okay, what about having this ratio on the second and third generation PTH assays on the liaison, if they are calibrated against the same PTH standards, of course. And we know that the second generation assay has a minimal cross-reactivity, and the third generation assay has a maximal cross-reactivity with the amino-PTH. So the question was, is this ratio also valid when we use the second and third generation from the Serum? And we also published that in GCEM. And we tested here also 10 patients that suffered from advanced parathyroid carcinoma. These patients were in our blood banks and had been previously determined with antibodies. And we test the ratio in 3 different populations: hemodialyzed patients, healthy individuals, and patients suffering from primary hyperparathyroidism. And here are the results. On the right side, you can see that out of those 10 patients suffering from parathyroid carcinoma, 2 were negative, whereas all the 8 others were positive. What is also interesting to note is that if you remember, with the Scantibodies assay, we had 4 patients that were negative, and here 2 out of those 4 patients became positive with the Serum second and third generation PTH assay. So even better performing. And you can see that in the comparative population, the hemodialyzed, the healthy, and the primary hyperparathyroid, there was a single false positive patient. It was a patient, hemodialyzed patient, suffering from very severe primary hyperparathyroidism. And we end with what I would call a new analytical challenge, which is oxidized PTH. So PTH has 2 methionines, one in position 18 and one in position 8. And we know that these methionines can be oxidized. We also know that when you oxidize PTH, you don't have any biological activity anymore. And if you reduce the oxidized PTH, you recover the biological activity. So oxidized is inactive, or oxidized PTH is inactive or very clear active, but inactive peptide. And it very recently, paper has shown that non-oxidized PTH was a determinant of mortality in hemodialyzed patients, which is very interesting. So is this oxidized PTH a new analytical target? I'm sorry, but I don't have the answer to that question. And even if there is a very, very good and well done clinical studies, we are still lacking a little bit of clinical studies to be sure that we should definitely measure not total oxidized, non-oxidized PTH, but only non-oxidized PTH. There is a kit that blocks the oxidized PTH by an antibody, and you can treat the serum of your sample with its own little column. The oxidized PTH is blocked and remains only the non-oxidized PTH. And what I've done here in this cartoon, it was just checking on 100 patients, or a little bit less than 100 patients, non-oxidized PTH against a total intact PTH. And these papers, this cartoon shows, is that you can, some patient here, if the one which is highlighted in red, this patient has a very, very high level of non-oxidized PTH, whereas this hemodialyzed patient has a quite low total intact PTH. So according to this patient and according to the intact PTH, the physician might want to have a higher level of PTH and treat the patient to increase the turnover of the patient, because the bone turnover, because he might think that this patient has a low bone turnover. Whereas this patient has a very, very active non-oxidized PTH. So treating this patient, over-treating this patient might be an error. And you can see also on the vertical red line that for the same level, let's say 40 picogram per ml of non-oxidized PTH, you can have a total PTH at 200 or 400. So this is very, very puzzling. This is very interesting, and we should definitely move forward to study this non-oxidized PTH, but in further studies. So my last slide will be to give you some important take-home message, which are that the third and the second generation PTH assays provide the same clinical information, so you can either use them for whatever patients. I hope that I convinced you that there is an important lack of standardization of PTH assays. Hopefully, standardization programs are ongoing. There are also tandem aspects which are improving, but the important message is that standardization will be only possible with third generation assays, because at least in patients suffering from chronic kidney disease, which are the patients for which it's very important to have a good standardization of PTH. So will be standardization okay, but only with third generation, not with intact. I hope that I also convince you that of the importance of the reference range. Having good reference range is very important, otherwise you can miss the patients suffering from secondary hyperpara. I hope also that I convince you that the amino-PTH is a new potential tumor marker in patients suffering from parathyroid cancer, and we'll see in the future with probably new tandem aspect methods or perhaps with the antibodies that what will be on this non-oxidized PTH, but it's a new challenge for the future, which will probably be interesting. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cavalier. Now, before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Cavalier, your first question is it better to run PTH on serum or EDTA plasma?
Thank you very much for this very, very good question, Christine, because it's very important that there is a huge and intense debate on this single subject. Should we use serum or EDTA? But many people think that PTH is more stable in EDTA plasma compared to the stability of PTH in serum. So that's the reason why people prefer to have PTH run in plasma, EDTA plasma. Our data have shown that unless you let your samples degrade at room temperature for more than 18 hours, which is not very good clinical practice, the stability of PTH in serum or EDTA is the same. Also, the long-term stability of PTH in serum or EDTA plasma is the same. So for me, what is more important is that you cannot interpret a PTH result without having a calcium value. And you cannot run calcium in EDTA plasma, meaning that you need to take two samples, one if you are using EDTA, one serum for the calcium, and the second one, which will be the EDTA plasma for the PTH, which does not make any sense to take two samples into two tubes into the patient. So for me, since it's better to have calcium determined in the same tube, I would suggest to use serum instead of EDTA plasma for PTH determination.
Thank you, Dr. Cavalier. Next question is, can we expect difference in the reference ranges of PTH according to the ethnicity?
Yes, Christy, this is something which is also very important, because when you look in the instruction for use of the manufacturers, you will not see any difference, or it's not sometimes not even mentioned in what kind of population the reference population was. I suspect that most of those population are Caucasian patients. And I also suspect that the reference range, if you did this reference range in other ethnicities, will come to different reference range, because the bone metabolism is different, for instance, in subjects from African ancestors compared to subjects with European ancestors. And I think that if your laboratory has a large amount of patients coming from different ethnicities, origins, that the reference range should be different. And I don't think that it's good practice to refer to PTH reference range obtained in Caucasian population and to compare this, to use this reference range for people from other ethnicities. So definitely for me, there is a huge work to do to have good reference range in different ethnicities, and I'm talking about African ancestries, but maybe also different with in patients from Asian ancestries. So a huge work needs to be done and needs to be undertaken by the IFCC to have good reference range with the different ethnicities, because it can be very different.
Dr. Cavalier, how should we report the PTH reference range for hemodialyzed patients?
Thank you for this really good question also. As you can see, you cannot use the reference range of the normal population in the hemodialyzed population. Because if you use the hemodialyzed patient, which would have a PTH value into the normal reference range, would definitely suffer from low bone turnover. So the KDIGO guidelines states that the PTH should be between 2 to 9 times the upper reference range of the laboratory. I try to show you what we considered as the upper reference range of the laboratory. But nevertheless, in my own hospital, for the hemodialyzed patient, I take my upper reference range and multiply it by 2 and 9, and I report this value for hemodialyzed patients. So to help the nephrologist to be in the good the frame for those patients. Now you can say between 2 or 7, 2 or 6 or whatsoever, but I think definitely that we should use the multiple of the upper reference range for those patients, and to provide this multiple of the reference range to the nephrologist. And just to remind you that the only guidelines, the only evidence with a 1A in the KDIGO guidelines is that there should be an important talk between the labs and the nephrologist, and this is totally true. We are linked together, and it's important to have a good contact and collaboration with them for the follow-up of this patient.
Thank you, Dr. Cavalier. We have so many great questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. This will have to be our last one. In clinical practice, When should we ask for a third-second PTH ratio determination?
This is also very important. So for me, in our practice and in our expertise, and we receive samples from different countries for that, we should think to run the ratio in patients which present very severe hyperparathyroidism with very high level of calcium. As proposed by Shoot, this value should be at 3 millimole, but I will not focus exactly on 3. But if you've got the patients that present, and especially also in young patients, that present very high values of PTH with a very high value of calcium, this patient definitely needs to have a ratio, because if this ratio is positive, then the surgeon knows that he might make some extra investigation and be perhaps a little bit more aggressive when he takes he resects the tumor. So that's for me in those patients that have very high level of calcium and quite high levels of PTH.
I would like to once again thank Dr. Cavalier for his presentation. Dr. Cavalier, do you have any final comments for our audience?
No, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that I was not too long. I don't know exactly the time that I planned, but PTH is something great. It's my PhD was in PTH. You can guess that, and it's quite complicated, but it's such a nice word, and we can be of so much help for our patients. And remember that primary hyperpara is one of the single disease that only clinical chemistry can detect. So PTH is a great word, and I hope that you spend a good time with us.
Again, thank you, Dr. Cavalier. I would also like to thank Etienne for making today's educational webcast possible. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through August 7th, 2017. You will receive an email from LabRoots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. We thank you for joining us and hope to see you next time. Goodbye.